Hey everybody, it's Rabbit. Welcome back to the channel, and today we're going to be continuing our Worst Map Ever series by looking at the map Jungle in the game of War Thunder. Now, the map of Jungle has been in the game of War Thunder for quite a while, however it was removed from rotation before being re-added when they did a revamp of the map. This improved how it played, but also adjusted how it looked. And I do have to say that after playing on the most recent version of Jungle, this is actually one of my favorite maps to play on, at least visually. I do like the nice vibrant colors, and this was one of the issues that War Thunder had, especially in its early days, is the developers tend to have a lot more saturated colors. They weren't very vibrant, and this worked for some of the maps, but for maps like Jungle, it really should be a little on the brighter side in terms of the overall contrast, so I do feel like this works pretty well. Also, as a completely useless piece of trivia, the very first night map I ever played on was Jungle, and it was in the M4 Sherman, because this was back in the days before the game actually had a minimum battle rating for night maps. This was also before illumination flares were added to night maps, and you might be wondering, how did I see anything? And the answer is I didn't. I wandered around for a bit and then died to an enemy that I couldn't even see. So that was exhilarating. Incidentally, if you are wondering why some random low-tier vehicles like the ASU-57 have the night vision upgrade because it basically serves no purpose now, it's basically just for completionist sake and also for legacy reasons, because there was actually a point in the game's history where the ASU-57 could see night maps. So in terms of overall size for the Jungle map, if you just look at the mini-map, it looks like it's basically a mid-size map. However, in reality, it's on the high end of a small-size map, and this has to do with the fact that a lot of the southwest and southeast and basically the entire north of the map is not playable either due to mountains or the giant ocean. Of course, obviously that does come with an asterisk, because the ocean part of the map is not actually inaccessible to the player. You can still use it, but you have to have basically an amphibious vehicle to do anything with it. There's even this little island into the northeast of the map that you can actually use as basically a camping spot if you happen to have an amphibious vehicle with a decent gun. All told, Jungle has 5 variations, and I would call these the standard variations, but they're not quite. You do have a 3 cap, a 2 cap, and then a single cap A, B, and C, except it's not actually a single cap A, B, and C. 2 of the single capture points are not actually capture points on the normal map, because as you can kind of see from the normal 3 cap map, 2 of the capture points are very close to one spawn, so it would be incredibly asymmetric if you did it that way. Now, as is the tradition, the first thing we're going to look at is, should you actually go for the capture point in the 2 cap variant of Jungle? And my immediate impression is that you really shouldn't. It's not that neither of the capture points has a decent amount of cover. In fact, they both have some cover where you can take refuge from hostile fire. However, the big issue is that, as you'll notice with both of them have you essentially sandwiched in between 2 spawn points. So unless you have a decent amount of your team with you, it's going to be very difficult to actually capture these. You either need a lot of teammates watching a lot of angles or other teammates overwatching you. In that case, you basically have so much control of the map, you are probably going to win anyway. So in the 2 cap variant of the map, I broadly wouldn't bother unless you're basically already in a pretty dominant position and the enemy's down to only 1 or 2 players. Now, looking at the capture point, the first thing we're going to do is actually A and B at the same time, because while there are some differences, they are in a very similar position. Both of them are closer to your team than the opponents, and both of them are pretty easy for your team to access. Additionally, both of them have a pretty decent amount of cover on the capture point. You're not completely covered. There are some angles that can still hit you while you're on these points, but in general, it's usually not that difficult to drive up and capture these points without getting spotted. The issue really comes once you capture them, what do? And most of that is just going through this giant sandy middle area in the middle of the map, or just wrapping all the way around north to flank. So while the A and B are easy to capture, there's often not that much to do once you capture them other than just skirmishing in the north part of the map and hoping that that matters. With that being said though, if you can be successful skirmishing, both the A and B point are right there, so you potentially get 2 capture points, and as I've discussed previously in this series, there's no reason to go for 3, you can win on 2. So if you can simply dominate this little stretch in the north of the map, you can just straight up win. The C point just ends up being fundamentally different than A or B because it's roughly equidistant to both spawns, but it's also on a raised area of land surrounded by a bit of a moat, so there's only so many bridges you can use to get to it. On top of that, the C point itself is heavily elevated, although there are positions you can get to around the C point where you can capture it without exposing yourself too much and get back off of it. So while you will find it more hotly contested by the enemy, it does provide you with more options to push out in the mid-map area than the A or B point. The movement lanes on jungle end up being very atypical for a 3-cap map, because normally when you have a 3-cap map, you expect your movement lanes to be basically spawn to spawn and then one going to the middle, but because 2 of the capture points are in the north and directly reachable by the north spawn, you actually end up with basically only 2 movement lanes. One of them is basically people going through and onto C, and the other one is people going back and forth between A and B. So really, if you're looking for a position to watch, you kind of want to watch both of these. The rest of the map does see activity, but it's considerably more sporadic. Now, in terms of power positions on this map, I'm going to do it a little differently than I do normal, because the north lane between A and B actually has 3 separate power positions. You have the power positions on A or B itself, because both of them are basically watching over this big empty area of sandy dunes that you can easily catch people out on. But then you have this one little hill in the middle of A and B that can also reflect a power position in of itself and can actually watch a fair bit of the map on both sides. So in general, controlling the north side of the map, not only do you have 2 capture points there, but you also have access to good lines of sight to the rest of the map. The big issue is that trying to push the enemy's capture point, whether you're pushing A or B, the enemy has a really good line of sight on you as well, so it's often fairly difficult to do this convincingly, especially as these power positions are not very far away from spawn. So even if you knock somebody out, unless you can capitalize on it right away, often the enemy will just reoccupy it. Then you have, of course, the major power position, and this one is really dominant. This is in the middle of the map, basically between the triangle of A, B, and C on this little island. And if you consult the footage in the background, this is one of those rare instances where I can specifically show you why the capture point is good, because you can see me covering the A-B cross and also covering the C point simultaneously from this one position, and it also works the next clip as well. This power position can see all 3 capture points in basically every major movement lane with no real issues. Now, this position used to be a lot more dominant before they changed it, because before they changed it, it had a lot of cover that you could easily use and make yourself a general pain, whereas now it's been evened out a lot more so that enemies can see onto this position more easily. That being said, it is such a dominant and commanding position of the map that it should still be a very high consideration for you to adopt, and you can definitely have good games on this particular position. The only other positions on this map that I would generally consider power positions are the positions in the absolute south of the map. These are positions that are very hard to contest and can stop somebody from going on the southern road. However, the big issue is that there just often isn't a lot of traffic here. You're going to see 1 to 2 people at most, unless there's an enemy squad that just has their mind set on going in this direction. So while it can be effective in severing enemy flanking opportunities, often there just isn't enough activity to justify staying there for an extended period of time. Now, since the 3 single cap setups use somewhat different layouts, I'll go into those in a minute and briefly touch on any differences they might have, but first I'll go into some more general map strategies. And one of the most general map strategies is simply to use something with a good long-range gun and watch the main gap between A and B. If you have a slower vehicle, setting up around A or B itself is often the best strategy, but if you have a faster vehicle, getting into any of the positions in the middle, either the hill directly between A or B, or alternatively the hill immediately north of C. All of these positions can watch a sizable chunk of the map, and as I said, A and B, if you control just those, you basically win the game. So being able to dominate that aspect of the map is incredibly useful. That being said, you shouldn't immediately disregard flanking opportunities. As I said, the southern road doesn't have a ton of activity because it doesn't have access to a lot of the map, but that does also mean that frequently you can find gaps in the southern road and you can just bypass the enemy entirely and get in behind their team. Sometimes people will be watching it, but quite often they won't. Additionally, if you have a heavy tech, simply being able to brawl your opponent off of C, especially given how easy it is to hold on to A or B, can often be a game-winning strategy as well. But you do generally need something with good armor or good gun depression to work the area around C, given how hilly that general area is, and obviously you need at least somebody to shut down the hill immediately north of C in order to take possession of the C point. Really shutting down the area north of C or taking over it yourself should be a priority most of the time on this map, because that can have the single highest impact on who wins. With that being said, one thing that I have found is that it is easy enough to contest that hill immediately north of C that it's not as much of a deciding factor as it was before the update to the jungle map, which I do think is a good thing. Now, in the single cap, where the single cap is the area that is immediately between A and B on a normal map, map, this is where it starts to get a little tricky, because it can often be difficult to get onto and off of this position, especially as people start getting set up in all the power positions around that nice big bowl. So really the best strategy here is to get a vehicle that is as fast as possible to take the area quickly, because often it will be incredibly difficult for your opponent to flip that point unless they get a really efficient flank off. That being said, you should also definitely be looking for flanking opportunities. Because of the way the spawns are oriented on this particular map, a lot of the south of the map is going to be free real estate, and if you can get in and around and behind a lot of the enemy's overwatch and power positions, you're going to be in a pretty good spot to basically shut down any attempt they have to retake the A point, or allow your team to retake the A point. In the single cap variant, where the zone is basically directly in the middle of the map, what you really should be looking to do is either take that position yourself or look for counter positions. And this is another interesting one. Much like the previous map, a lot of people won't be watching the north as heavily, but the north has a lot of good positions to shoot onto the A point for somebody that might not be suspecting it. So it is a viable strategy. In this particular variant, however, you will notice a lot more activity in the south of the map because that's simply the way it resolves. I do find in this particular variant, the left-hand spawn actually has the advantage because the left-hand spawn has fully covered positions that can get to the A point, whereas the right-hand spawn can kind of do it, but it's a lot more awkward and you're a lot more exposed if the left-hand spawn flanks the north. In the final single cap variant of jungle, where you have the point on what is normally the C cap, this is where things start to get interesting because obviously you probably want your heavy tanks brawling on point and any tank with good gun depression trying to work the angles around that hill. But this is also where the southern flank really comes into its own, because while you probably will see a lot more activity, you can actually cut off the bridges going to the capture point much more easily on this map, because in the previous setups where you had the 3 cap, this position was normally only cutting access off to one of the 3 possible points. Now it's cutting access off to the only possible point, which could potentially be devastating for the enemy team. You are much more likely to be fought in this area on this particular variant, but the southern flank can be a lot more useful. That being said, the area immediately north of the capture point is completely dominant. It is incredibly difficult to sustain the A point if the enemy controls the hill immediately north of the capture point, because they can just cut off all of your reinforcements and take out people on cap fairly easily, which means the northern flank can't really be neglected either. As for my overall thoughts on jungle, I do think the rework for jungle did help a lot in terms of its general map flow, because it did cut off some of the more abusive positions that you could get into, and also made the central hill way less dominant than it used to be. The central hill actually used to have things like bunkers around it that you could use as really solid hard cover. Even though you were kind of susceptible to aircraft in that position, it was incredibly dominant across the entire map if a plane didn't uproot you. So adding more potential to shoot onto that capture point definitely made the map play a lot more fluid, whereas previously it used to be incredibly rigid. And like I said, I do really like it when they rework a map to have much more vibrant colors, because a lot of the War Thunder maps tend to have a pretty muted color palette, and having a nice change of pace every now and then is pretty nice. I will also say that I do appreciate the fact that this is one of the few maps where there is actually a unique flanking opportunity if you do have an amphibious vehicle. That being said, there just aren't quite enough amphibious vehicles to really make good on it, but it is something to keep in the back of your mind if you do have a vehicle of that type. One other feature that I do like about the rework is that they reworked a lot of the low brush, because jungle used to be the kind of map where it was very easy for tanks to just hide in the open, whereas now with the new vibrant colors, it's a lot less likely that you're just going to get caught off guard. Previously, when you had a lot of the bush, and a lot of the bushes were very dull in color, even tanks that weren't specifically set up to be camouflage could easily hide in those areas, whereas now it's a lot harder, so visibility in general is greatly improved on the map. Overall, I feel like jungle plays a lot better than it used to. It plays as a much more dynamic map where points can actually change hands on a regular basis, whereas old school jungle used to just be very static and honestly a bit dull to play at times because there was really one specific strategy that just overpowered the rest. Honestly, I think it's just a pretty well thought out, well designed map that actually works pretty well, at least for the battle ratings that it's played at. But of course, those are just my thoughts on the matter. Let me know in the comments down below what you think of the jungle map in the game of War Thunder. Do you love it? Do you hate it? I always love to hear from you guys. If you liked the video, you found it entertaining, a like and subscribe always helps out the channel. As always, danke bitte, tschüss.